Hey everybody, this is Alzorath, and welcome to Friday Night Hex episode number 3. These are only going to be going up until the release of the game. They might go past that if there's enough interest in it, or if there's enough topics for me to cover, although it's probably not going to be a weekly thing after the game releases. So I'm going to go ahead and say congratulations to all 3 winners. Their names will be listed in the description below. I'm not sure if I'm going to include their responses or not, but you're welcome to look them up on the previous video if I do not. And yeah, the messages have already sent to Cryptozoic. The emails for them should be sent out probably a little bit closer to the time of the alpha. If there's any problems with it, feel free to contact me, and I will do my best to rectify the situation as best as possible, though I don't see any problems coming up. I've already discussed this with Cryptozoic on several emails, and they directed me on how to do it, and I did it exactly as directed, so it shouldn't be a problem. But anyway, with the huge results, I'm going to go ahead and give you the total number of votes. There were 124 entries, and I'm just like, wow. Just wow. I have to say that due to that turnout, I will definitely be hosting more Hex contests, especially after the beta releases and even into the release of the full game. Their scope will vary. Some of them will be bigger, some will be smaller. It'll vary. But yeah, we have an overall winner. The most popular choice was Inner Conflict. This was pretty easy to see from the comments, as a huge amount of them got that. But there were some close runner-ups, and even one completely ignored one. That was the Blood Thrall, and I feel a little sorry for him. Now, since this is the Roundup, I'm going to go ahead and give my opinions on the various booster contests. As far as the contest, by the way, for those of you who missed the episode, the contest was to pick your first draft choice. You just opened this pack, you haven't drafted anything, what do you choose and what do you go for? And you had to describe in the description in the comments, what you wanted to come from that and why you were making your choice. Now, obviously, while I'm going through these, I will miss some points, simply because I'm doing this off the top of my head and just looking at the card list. So I'll try to include them either in annotations or in the editing of the video. So I will forget stuff. That's just how it is. There's 15 cards here, and I can't remember everything. I'm going to try and actually include some of the more interesting points that were brought up in the comments as well, although I can't promise to attribute it because there's 150 some odd comments there. My memory is not that good. But anyway, let's go ahead and dive in, and we'll go ahead and look at the 15 cards. The first one we're going to start with is the rare, the Pact of Pain. Some people actually even openly admitted to choosing this for rare hunting, which is perfectly acceptable. So congratulations to you guys who were being honest about it. Now, the stats on the card are, it's a 2-cost card with a 2 blood threshold. It's a constant. You pay 2 resources and 2 health, and you draw a card. Plain and simple, very straightforward. It's a draw engine. Downside is it does cost you 2 health, and it locks down 2 resources for each turn you want to draw a card. You can continually use it, though, because you don't exhaust the card. So you could do a whole bunch of chunk in one turn if you needed a surge of cards. Now, the thing is, for this card to be really functional, you need some way to cover either the resource cost or the health cost, or both. This involves including drain, life gain, or some kind of resource recovery card into your deck. And honestly, this kind of drawback and the need for a combo to make this truly effective, even in a 30-card deck, you would be draining out of resources fast. And remember, you have to survive the onslaught of your opponent as well. This card doesn't really quite make it for me. I would not be picking this as first pick unless I was rare drafting. So it is a decent card. It's an okay first pick, and there were 13 votes for it. And yes, draw is very, very powerful in draft because you have a lot of 1-off and 2-off setups. Very rare do you ever get a 3-off. And yeah, it's good, but the drawbacks are too much for me to choose it as a first pick. If it comes back around and I have the proper cards for it, I would definitely consider picking up later in the draft, but not early on. I can't really rely on getting those other cards that I need. Now, we'll move on to the uncommons, which It actually holds one of the unloved cards. It got 0 votes out of 124. It got absolutely 0 votes, and that is the Blood Thrall. Blood Thrall is a 3 cost, 2 blood threshold, basic action, and when a troop you control deals damage to an opposing champion this turn, that champion chooses and discards a card. I'm surprised this got 0 votes. I expected it to maybe get 1 or 2, and I kind of chose it as a drop-off pick because it's obviously not my first pick. But should you find this card in a swarm deck such as a Blood Growth Shin Hair deck, just putting that one out there, you can overwhelm the opponent and just make them discard their entire hand, which is really powerful against draw decks as well as against, well, pretty much any kind of deck that holds onto its hand, which is most decks. The thing is, you have to be able to swarm your opponent and get past the creatures, otherwise they're just going to negate it, and it's going to disappear at the end of turn. If it was a constant, it would be a lot more powerful, but it's not, so it definitely does not make that first pick. And honestly, I won't see myself playing with this in any drafts unless I have a very specific setup, and it would be a very, very late pick for me. I see this being more useful and constructed, if even then. Of course, Blood Thrall also works well with flyers, because they evade, so that's something else to keep in mind. Let's go ahead and move on to the next uncommon, which is GoreSeeker. 5 cost, 2 ruby threshold troop. It's an Orc Warrior that's a 2/2 with Swiftstrike, which is essentially the equivalent to First Strike, and Rage 1, which is +1/+0 attack whenever it attacks, and it's permanent. Even if it dies, you can bring it back and blah, blah, blah. Now, we had 2 votes for this one. I honestly expected it to be lower on the rating than Blood Thrall, but a lot of people mentioned it, or at least were looking at it. Obviously, with its lack of evasion, it's not going to be a first pick for me, because it's got to survive long enough to get that plus damage to make the Swiftstrike useful. Thing is, at 5 costs, it's going to be coming out late. It's going to be coming out in the face of other troops, most likely. It's going to have to survive somehow, and by itself, it is not that strong. If it was a late draft pick and I had the deck to support it, I would definitely pick up GoreSeeker, but it is, again, not going to be my first pick or even really a contender for it. None of these first ones have been really on my first pick list. So we're going to go ahead and move on to the third uncommon, and that is the Fate Rack. It's 3 cost, 0 threshold because it's an artifact. It's 1 resource, and the effect for 1 resource and to exhaust the card, you get target champion buries the top 2 cards of their deck. Really good mill, and in draft, mill is okay. If you get enough mill, it can be exceptional, but relying on just 1 or 2 mill cards, unless it's supported by something else, is not very strong. It's an okay first pick. We did have 3 people choose it, and I don't see a problem with choosing it as your first pick if you're unsure what direction you want to go. But if you have other choices in the first deck, I honestly would try to start setting up what you're actually going to go for. Whereas the Fate Rack is very neutral, very middle of the road. It's not exactly a cornerstone card. It's one of those that you pick up late draft for kind of an alternate win condition or alternate support for your win condition. So look at Fate Rack as a possible, but I personally would not choose it as a first pick. All of my top picks are going to be in the commons, for those of you that are wondering, and those are what we're coming up on next. I'm going to go ahead and start with Burn. This is definitely first pick material. We got 16 votes for it. Not the top vote, but definitely decent there. Burn it fills the role of removal, and it also fills the role of trick for like combat tricks. It fills the role of, well, finisher. If you draw your opponent down low, you can draw it and finish them off. It's a good kind of basic card to have around, and I do see it being a major role in people who are playing Ruby in the draft format. Burn would be good if you decided match to go with a Ruby based build. Obviously you're not going to go solo Ruby, but seeing as how it's 1 cost, 1 Ruby threshold quick action that deals 2 damage to target troop or champion, it's a decent little cantrip to have in there. It's a good pick. It's not my personal first pick if I was just going into a draft blind, not deciding what I wanted beforehand. So it's not my absolute first pick, but is definitely a contender should I want to be playing Ruby on that draft. So we're going to go ahead and move on to the next big pick, and that is actually also a common. It is Thunderbird. It got 20 votes. It is easily the second place one, considering... Actually, it is absolutely the second place one at 20 votes, considering that Burn is third and Pact of Pain was fourth. Thunderbird is an amazing card. It's kind of a sleeper pick because you have to have a lot of experience with TCGs to really see how it can kind of escalate. And a lot of people did mention the turn clock that it puts the opponent on. Now, Thunderbird, as far as its stats, is 2 cost, 2 Sapphire threshold, which means you have to be playing a little Sapphire heavy to use it, but it is a flying unit. It has flight. It's only going to be a 1/1 coming out, but it has Rage 1. When it attacks, it gets a permanent +1/+0. Now, if the opponent doesn't have an answer to the Thunderbird, which Burn would be, and later on we'll be covering Inner Conflict, which is another answer to it, or a flyer of their own, they're going to be forced into a situation where they have to waste a lot of resources either preventing the Thunderbird from attacking or finding something else to stop this beast from just train wrecking into them. Now, the Thunderbird is really high on my first pick list, and honestly, out of the pack, I would go for Thunderbird sometimes. Now, with me, I'm not going to say which one is my absolute always first pick because I don't really have an absolute always first pick from these cards. Thunderbird is a definite, if I want to go for blue or if I see promise in blue, I'm going to go for it because this card is an early drop, turn 2, easy drop, especially if you're only dual color. And it's got the evasion to survive and bypass most of the enemy's other early drops. Even if they're going Swarm with Shin Hair, this thing will get past them because there's not a lot of flight in Shin Hair. So this is a definite high pick on my first choice, and I would highly recommend going with this one if you are new to drafting or if you just want a solid early pick creature in your deck. Now, obviously, it's not a bomb. Some people are saying it's a bomb. It's a 6-turn clock, which is good, but it's not exactly going to completely dominate everything. It's just a little too fragile to be considered a true bomb, especially considering there is a direct answer in this pack in Burn. So whoever picks up that Burn has an answer to your Thunderbird. Considering they're both common, you're going to be seeing them quite a bit in the matchups, especially with the fact that starting out in drafts, we only have the initial set. We don't have a full block to pull from. So anyways, let's go ahead and move on to the next common. That is Terrible Transfer. This one had, let's go ahead and move over the screen, only 2 votes. I expected slightly more because I threw it in there as kind of a trap to see how many people would pick it. Now, Terrible Transfer is a bit of a unique situation. It can be very, very powerful and constructed whenever you're playing a solo blood or a main blood deck because you have all those resources to cause it to do its effect. Now, Terrible Transfer is 5 cost, 1 of it blood. It's a quick action, means it can work as a cantrip, and it deals 1 damage to target troop for each blood resource you have. Notice it says just target troop. It does not say champion. You gain 1 health for each damage dealt this way. This is a good cantrip. It's easily outclassed by Burn because Burn is just much more cost effective, and it's much easier to keep that 1 resource free than it is to keep 5 resource free for a cantrip. And considering you will be going dual color, if not 3 color in a draft, chances of you having a whole mess of blood out to justify that 5 cost, not really that feasible. Now, if you do pick it, I would pick it as a late draft pick for a blood heavy deck. But early on, first pick, you cannot rely on sticking with blood or even having blood main, since you don't know what the rest of the draft comes out with. If you see Terrible Transfer come around again and you have a decent amount of blood, go ahead and pick it. But other than that, I would pass on this one. This one's definitely a pass for me on first pick, maybe a late pick. Although it's definitely one of those cards that shines much more in Constructed. And with that, we'll go ahead and move on to the next common. That's going to be Sensei of the Milky Eye. It's a 2-cost card with 1 wild threshold. It's a troop, which is just a Shinhair Sensei. He's a 1/1, so he's not really that much of a presence on the field. And whenever he enters play, you draw a card. This makes him card advantage neutral, kind of. Now, you do lose the card by putting it into play, but you draw a card, so unless you're going to be running out of cards, it's pretty neutral in that respect. It is a chump blocker. It got 8 votes, which is decent. Not really great, but it is a decent little trick card. I wouldn't put it as my first pick, but if it comes back around and you are playing wild, it's worth looking at as just a guy. It's not a bomb, it's not a removal, it's not even a very efficient card really, besides providing a chump blocker, but it does give you that draw and a little bit of acceleration in addition to having a chump blocker on the field. So it's kind of a guy pick, but I wouldn't really pick it as a first pick, if that makes sense. So that said, let's go ahead and move on to yet another common. Of course, all of these are commons. And that is Inner Conflict. It's 2 costs and 1 diamond threshold, basic action. Target troop gets permanent. This troop can't attack or block. This falls into the category as Thunderbird and Burn, in that it is definitely up there for a first pick choice. The cheapness of it is great. The fact that it's a permanent, this troop can't attack or block, so that means that even if your opponent finds some way to play a recursive deck in draft, they cannot use the creature that Inner Conflict has targeted. The downside to Inner Conflict is the fact that it is a basic action. It is not a cantrip. This is where Burn can actually directly compete with it, because Burn can serve as that cantrip. It can drop out at any time, be a threat for that 1 cost, 1 ruby threshold effect. It can be there in their face. Whereas Inner Conflict, you have to decide on your turn to stop them. This means that Inner Conflict cannot stop hasters. It cannot stop creatures that you're kind of on the fence about but don't really want to deal with until they're in your face. It's a on your turn effect. Inner Conflict, Thunderbird, and Burn, all 3 fall into the category of let's consider this as a definite option. Let's look at it. Let's go with it. Let's see what we can do with it. These are cards that fall for the first pick that I would really be on the fence about which one to choose. It just depends on what flavor I want to go for that day. Inner Conflict I would choose if I was going diamond and kind of defensive. Thunderbird or Burn I would go more for if I was going aggro. Now, with that, speaking of aggro, we're going to go ahead and move on to the next common, and it got a surprisingly low amount of votes. Well, not terribly low. It got the same as Sensei of the Milky Eye, but still lower than I thought it would, and that is Command Tower. It's 3 costs, 0 threshold. It's an artifact, of course, and it just gives you a blanket. Troops you control get +1/+0. This is kind of the sleeper of the contest. I put it in there on purpose because there was a discussion recently in Clan Blackbade. I'm going to mispronounce that a million times because it's all one word. Clan Blackblade's recent discussion in Guild about a person's deck, and we were comparing various little boosts. And as some of you know, there is a growth card that gives +1/+1, I believe it is. I'm just drawing this off the top of my head, to all troops in play. Command Tower gives +1/+0 to all troops while Command Tower is in play. And it's fairly cheap at 3 cost. Now, the reason why this card is kind of a sleeper is because due to the first set, it's very much there's a lot of cards in the first set that multiply, that are reliant on having swarms. They're very group based, and this is something that is worth looking at. If you can reliably get these swarms, Command Tower can be very powerful. While Command Tower is not necessarily on the first pick list for me, if I was going to go for a lot of cheap allies, if that was like my plan before even going into the draft, Command Tower would actually be picked above the rest. And seeing as how there are a lot of really cheap, really effective allies to choose from in this initial set, it's not a terrible pick. Now, as sets go on, Command Tower's functionality will kind of waver, and as you get into set 2 and 3, I have a feeling that Command Tower's worth will drop in draft. But in this first set, I actually do like Command Tower as a potential alternate strategy first pick, even though it's not a I'm just playing draft because I want to draft first pick, if that makes any sense whatsoever. So Command Tower, if you're going Zerg, it's kind of conditional like the burn conditional, where if you're going red, you always want to pick up burn. Command Tower is, if you're going Zerg, you always want to pick up Command Tower, because that is a massive boost if you have 7 or 8 creatures on the field while your opponent only has, say, 2. That can add up fast, cutting that turn timer way, way down. But that said, Command Tower, not an initial first pick, but kind of a sleeper first pick. And I'm surprised it didn't get more votes. Most people completely ignored it, oddly enough. So it's something to look at. And it's a good lucky draw, although it's unreliable. Just let's be honest. And with the lack of removal or a limited removal available in the first set that is kind of looking like, Command Tower does have that permanence that's worthwhile. As more removal comes in, it becomes less valuable. And let's go ahead and move on to the next commons before I ramble my head off, and that is Wild Growth. It's 1 cost, 1 wild resource threshold. It's a quick action. Target troop gets +4/+4 this turn. One of the few non-permanent growth effects. It is a cantrip, which works in the same vein as Burn. If you were going pure growth or heavy growth, or if you decided you wanted to use, not growth, wild, apologies, getting my games mixed up there. If you're going heavy wild, or plan to in the draft, Wild Growth is a good cantrip. It would not be a first pick for me, although it is a decent one. If you're going growth Sapphire, you'd choose Thunderbird. If you're going growth Ruby, you're going Burn. If you're going growth Diamond, you're going Inner Conflict. If you're going growth Blood, you're going growth Blood. You don't really have many choices in this one, so Wild Growth might actually be the decent choice. Although there are other things that you could look at in terms of blood tools. Like Death Dealer. I'm not sure whether I'd choose Death Dealer or Wild Growth first. I think Wild Growth would win it out, though. And as a quick action, you can cast it whenever you want, so it does serve as a trick. And at 1 cost, it is effective. You can leave 1 resource open very easily compared to leaving, say, 5 resources open. So Wild Growth is not a first pick, but it is a decent pick, in my opinion. And we'll go ahead and move on to another common, and that is Death Dealer. I'm surprised Death Dealer got more votes than Blood Thrall. Death Dealer got 2 votes. 2 votes. It's 3 cost, 1 blood threshold, troop, which is an orc rogue. It's a 3/2, and it has no special abilities. It's a guy. It's a slightly strong guy. At 3 costs for a 3/2, that's not terrible. It's a deterrent. It can trade with a lot of things. And if you combine it with Wild Growth or Command Tower, it can trade with even more things. And Wild Growth actually keeps it from legitimately trading. It just makes it survive, making that a 7/6 if the Wild Growth comes back around. So honestly, out of the 2, I would pick Wild Growth first and hope Death Dealer rolls back around and use that in combination with it. You could go Wild Blood, and there's a lot of synergy between those 2 colors anyway, so it's something to definitely look at. Death Dealer, not a first pick in any sense of the word. It is a good late pick. It's a good guy pick whenever you just need low curve guys. 3 resource cost, not bad, especially considering it's 1 threshold. It's an early guy. I consider 1 through 3 early and higher than that to be late. I wouldn't mind seeing Death Dealer in my opening hand if I got the blood resource, so because you can easily draw up to that 3 cost. Apologies. And so let's go ahead and move on to yet another common, and that's Nuts and Bolts. It's 5 costs, 2 Sapphire threshold. It's a basic action, meaning, again, only on your turn, and it creates a Warbot and a Worker Bot and puts them into play. There were some votes for this one. No real big discussion on it, though. It's 2 troops for the cost of 1 card. So semi-efficient on the card amount, but really inefficient on the cost. Again, it's a 5 cost for relatively weak allies for that cost. I mean, the Warbot is a 3/3, which isn't horrible. It trades with Death Dealer. And Worker Bot is a chump blocker, just straight up. It's a 1/1 defensive. Defensive means it can't attack, so it just sits there and waits for something to block. You can sacrifice it to other creatures, but in this first pack, you didn't have any sacrificers, so can't really rely on that coming up. So Nuts and Bolts, not a first pick for me, but if you really needed it, I suppose you could get it. I personally don't like it. I can see more uses for it in Constructed, where you can rely on comboing it into things and playing through bumping things back to your hand and the such. But I don't see it as really being useful for the draft play. I don't like it as a first pick. I probably wouldn't even play it if I got it as a late pick. I hate to disappoint some of you with that, because Nuts and Bolts, the concept is really interesting, but its cost is just too high, in my opinion. And considering it's a basic action, it doesn't really have any trick effects. If it was a quick action, definitely it would move way up on my choices. So, but as a basic action, no. Let's go ahead and move on to the next one, which is, and I'm going to take a while to pronounce this, Adamanthian Scrivener. It's a 1 cost, 1 diamond threshold creature. Oddly enough, didn't get a lot of votes. It only got 4. This is because it's a life gainer rather than a killer, so it's not really a win condition. It's a troop human cleric 1/1. When a troop enters play under your control, gain 1 health. If you go, again, this is another tool that can be used with the command tower. If you're going the Zergy route, the Adamanthian can be very useful because it works right along with the Zerg route. It combines well with Command Tower. It combines well with the Swarm nature of growth. So a Diamond Growth deck would actually work well with this if you could rely on getting the cards you needed. As it stands, it's not really going to be that useful. If I was going to go with a first pick for a Zergy deck, I would choose Command Tower first. Adamanthian would be if it comes back around, I will definitely pick it for a Zergy build. It's not a first pick. I don't like it as a first pick. I like it as a late pick or as a cheap guy. It's a 1/1 chump blocker for 1 resource in Diamond. If you're playing Diamond, it's a good late pick, not a first pick. And finally, we're going to close in on the last of the commons. It's the Blood Aura. It got 4 votes as well. It's 2 cost, 1 blood threshold. It's a basic action, and its target troop gets permanent +1/+1, and this troop can't be blocked except by artifact troops or blood troops. This one I included because I like the thought of permanent changes to my troops. Now, in Magic the Gathering, which I'm going to make the comparison, I tried to avoid it as long as possible in this episode, but in Magic the Gathering, enchantments go away when the creature dies. And blood tends to lend itself to a bit of recursion. This card is another bit of a sleeper for me because it is a permanent effect. Not an enchantment. It doesn't go away if it bounces. The only thing that makes this card really not a first pick is the fact that it's a basic action. If it was a quick action, it would be a contender, although it would be still beaten out by Wild Growth as far as the cost effectiveness goes and as far as first pick goes, but Blood Aura would be a much higher choice if it was a quick action. Now, this card is useful in a number of ways. If you're saying going Blood Sapphire and you happen to pick up that Thunderbird and Blood Aura just creeps its way back around because it's dismissed, that's actually a good combo. Not only would it be unable to be blocked except by artifact troops and blood troops, it would gain more life, more damage, and be flying. You wouldn't be able to survive a burn, but it would be a presence that would make it much more difficult to deal with. Although, considering its draft, you're not going to be able to reliably draw this, so you can't rely on that combo. It's just a nice thing to have around. Blood Aura, not a first pick, maybe a late pick, and I do think it's underrated because it is a permanent effect, and if you do get any recursion, it can work well. Thing is, getting that recursion isn't exactly going to be reliable, so look at Blood Aura, don't pick it on your first time around. So for the most part, I actually somewhat agree with the choices players made, although I would rate Command Tower higher and Pact of Pain lower on the list, without a doubt. But overall, your votes were about on par with what I expected, except for the areas that I noted with exception. And it was a really good contest, and I really enjoyed having you guys be part of it. And this recording has gotten to 30 minutes. I have rambled a bit longer than I hoped. I was hoping for a 20-minute episode. But yeah, if you guys enjoy this, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, share it, as that's the only way this channel will grow. And honestly, the channel will be needing to pay for most of the contests that I hold. So be sure to like, comment, share it with your friends on Facebook, and be sure to subscribe if you enjoy my content. I'm looking so forward to doing drafts on here. I'm like eager as hell to do that. And I'm also eager to look at the constructed format, if even just from the side, because it's going to be a little bit expensive for me to get into. I don't really have that kind of money floating around. But I hope you guys enjoyed it, and keep gaming, have fun, peace out. This has been Alzorath, and I will see you guys next Friday on Friday Night Hex, where I'll be covering some of my opinions on Hex and maybe some strategic things. I'm not sure yet. I haven't decided on next week's episode. If you guys have any ideas for it, suggest them down below, and I'll look at the topic and consider putting it in. But yeah, bye. See you next time.